Dostoevsky, who normally kept away from museums and picture galleries as far as possible, paid a special visit to this Museum of Art in Basel to see this painting, Christ Taken Down from the Cross, by Hans Holbein the Younger. He'd heard about this picture, and what he had heard had greatly impressed him. This is how his wife Anna, in her diary, describes Dostoevsky's reaction to seeing the original. The painting overwhelmed Fyodor Mikhailovich, and he stopped in front of it as if stricken. On his agitated face was the sort of frightened expression I'd often noted during the first moments of an epileptic seizure. I quietly took my husband's arm, led him to another room, and made him sit down on a bench, expecting him to have a seizure any minute. Fortunately, it didn't come. Little by little, Fyodor Mikhailovich calmed down. When we were leaving, he insisted on going to take another look at the painting that had made such an impression on him. Anna's own reaction was one of revulsion. She writes of the painting that, contrary to tradition, Christ is depicted with an emaciated body, the bones and ribs showing, the hands and feet pierced by wounds, swollen and very blue, as in a corpse that is beginning to rot. The face is agonized and the eyes are half open, but unseeing and expressionless. The nose, mouth, and chin have turned blue. The reason that Anna was so horrified was that Holbein's picture shows the body of Christ in a state of decomposition. On the other hand, as far as Dostoevsky was concerned, the picture's fascination was precisely that it did show Christ's body decomposing. If his body was not subject to decay like other bodies, then the sacrifice on the cross was quite meaningless. Christ had to be a man like other men in order to die for men. In other words, at the incarnation, God did truly become a man. Dostoevsky's wanderings outside Russia brought him in 1867 to this famous city of Geneva, where so many wanderers of one sort and another have come. On the shores of this lake, it's safe to say that more explosive words have been uttered and more explosive ideas entertained than anywhere else in modern times. From Rousseau to Lenin, it's been the seedbed of revolution. As though to redress the balance, the city itself has remained one of the bastions of bourgeois orthodoxy, when so many of its citadels elsewhere have been falling. An ideological adventurer may still deposit his savings here with a reasonable assurance that they'll remain intact, whatever may have been the consequences of the propagation of his ideas elsewhere. Harassed by his usual money troubles and over the late delivery of his work, in this case The Idiot, which he was struggling to finish, Dostoevsky took a sour view of both the revolutionary ideas and their bourgeois cushioning. In his letters, he complains equally of the awfulness of life in Geneva, on Sundays particularly, and of the various enragés assembled for an international congress under the auspices of a League for Peace and Freedom, some of whom, Herzen and Bakunin, for instance, were known to him. How many such congresses there were to be in Geneva culminating in the largest, longest, most publicized, and most futile, the League of Nations, whose fine new Palais des Nations was completed just when the organization itself, to all intents and purposes, had ceased to function. For the title of his next novel, written here in Geneva, Dostoevsky chose The Devils. His theme is that the subversive ideas of the age were entering into people's minds as the devils entered into the Gadarene swine, and would similarly destroy them. Raskolnikov's insistence that he had a right to kill, translated into politics, led straight to Bakunin's dictum that destruction is in itself creative, and so to revolution for revolution's own sake. Thus, today's Raskolnikov is tomorrow's Nechayev, the young student revolutionary terrorist on whom Dostoevsky based the character Peter Verhovensky. By inducing the young to follow Raskolnikov and throw aside all restraint in their personal behavior, the way is prepared for a corresponding lack of restraint in the exercise of power. A generation or two of debauchery, Peter Verhovensky says, followed by a little drop of nice, fresh blood just to accustom people, and then the turmoil will begin. Today, a century later, it's well underway. What Dostoevsky understood with such wonderful clarity is that the romantic notions of old Verhovensky are the inevitable prelude to the devilish ones of his son Peter, and that both derive from the man who might be regarded as the patron saint of this place, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who insisted that men can only be free when they do what they like, and that doing what they like is conducive to their individual and collective happiness, peace, and security. Exactly the opposite, Dostoevsky says, is the case. When men are dominated by their own desires, they fall into the most terrible of all servitudes. Young Verhovensky is simply old Verhovensky writ large. The old one is serious and foolish. The young one is frivolous and merciless. And after them both comes inexorably the Gadarene rush over the cliff. Old Verhovensky is a marvelous piece of characterization, immensely funny, and in his own way, immensely touching. How often his voice has been heard in this place, calling for peace, for liberty, for democracy. He's Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, he's Bertrand Russell, he's Pope John, he's every siren voice urging us to follow Peter Verhovensky, who's waiting to hand us over to the sloganeers, the brainwashers, the dogmatists, from whom there can be no escape. With the devils out of the way, Dostoevsky knew that the book he projected next could only be written in Russia. And it was with infinite relief and delight that he and Anna made arrangements to return there after their long and troubled exile. They arrived back in Petersburg in the summer of 1871, with 10 years, the most fruitful and serene of his life, before them. Thanks to Anna's careful management, they were able to acquire a house in Staraya Russa, an ancient town in Novgorod province. And there, in tranquility, he wrote A Raw Youth, worked on the Brothers Karamazov, and prepared his Pushkin memorial speech. There's a description of the town in the Brothers Karamazov, and he imagined that from his window he could see the old white monastery where Alyosha was a monk and Father Zosima died.
Before starting work seriously on the Brothers Karamazov in the spring of 1878, Dostoevsky paid a visit to Optina Pustin Monastery in the neighborhood of Tula and the family estate where his father had been murdered by his serfs. He stayed there 2 days and had several conversations with the saintly Father Ambrosius, the original of Father Zosima and the Brothers Karamazov. Many years later, Tolstoy visited Optina Pustin on his last tragic journey, which ended in the station master's house at Ostapova. Both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, in their different ways, were fascinated by monasticism, which has now, in the old traditional sense, been ended in Russia. But many of the monasteries themselves, like this one, Novodevichy on the outskirts of Moscow, have been painstakingly preserved and restored as national monuments, to be stared at by tourists, and perhaps one day, as Christians may dream, to receive back their monks. Dostoevsky was a God-possessed man, if ever there was one, as is clear in everything he wrote and in every character he created. All his life he was questing for God, and only found him, if indeed he ever really did, at the end of his days, after passing through what he called the hell-fire of doubt. Freedom to choose between good and evil he saw as the very essence of earthly existence. Better even to choose evil than to have no choice. The devil, he insists, has a necessary role in our human drama. Without him, there can be no play, though there can be contentment and well-being of a kind. This was Tolstoy's dream of a kingdom of heaven on earth, which was to Dostoevsky deeply abhorrent. This is the dream, too, of all authoritarians, temporal and ecclesiastical, especially the latter. As Dostoevsky explains in one of his most famous passages, Ivan Karamazov's account to his brother Alyosha of an imaginary encounter between the Grand Inquisitor and the returned Christ in 16th century Seville.
Christ has reappeared among the people and been recognized. He's performed miracles, as he did in Galilee. In his infinite mercy, he once more walked among men in the semblance of man. The people are drawn to him by an irresistible force. They surround him, they throng about him, they follow him. He walks among them in silence, with a gentle smile of infinite compassion. The sun of love burns in his heart. Rays of light, of enlightenment, and of power stream from his eyes, and, pouring over the people, stir their hearts with responsive love. He stretches forth his hands to them, blesses them, and a healing virtue comes from contact with him, even from his garments. Then, in the Cathedral of Seville, he raises from the dead a small girl who has been brought in there for burial. Just as she's sitting up in her coffin and looking round her with surprise in her smiling eyes, just at that moment, the Cardinal himself, the Grand Inquisitor, passes by the cathedral in the square. He's an old man of nearly 90, tall and erect, with a shriveled face and sunken eyes from which, though a light like a fiery spark still gleams. He stops in front of the crowd and watches from a distance. He sees everything, and his face darkens. He knits his gray, beetling brows, and his eyes flash with an ominous fire. He stretches forth his finger and commands the guard to seize him. The guards take their prisoner to the dark, narrow, vaulted prison in the old building of the Sacred Court and lock him in there. The day passes, and night falls, the dark, hot, and breathless Seville night. The air is heavy with the scent of laurel and lemons. Amid the profound darkness, the iron door of the prison is suddenly opened, and the old Grand Inquisitor himself slowly enters the prison with a light in his hand. He's alone, and the door at once closes behind him. He stops in the doorway and gazes for a long time, for more than a minute, into his face. At last, he approaches him slowly, puts the lamp on the table, and says to him, "Is it you? You?" The terrible burden that Christ had laid on mankind, the Grand Inquisitor explained, was freedom. When in the wilderness the devil offered deliverance from this burden, the offer was recklessly rejected. Thus, Christ refused to turn stones into bread, thereby abolishing hunger, and refused to jump from a high pinnacle in the temple to create wonder and awe, thereby attracting people to him and his cause, and refused to take over the kingdoms of the earth, thereby putting himself in a position to create utopias everywhere. He even, for the sake of freedom, insisted on dying himself. However, quite soon after his death, his church decided to close with the devil's offer, and in place of freedom, provided miracles, mystery, and authority. In contemporary terms, affluence, the marvels of science, and an all-powerful state, to the very great betterment of the human condition. If now Christ remained in the world, he'd upset everything again with this terrible, devastating, sublime freedom of his. So, again, he must die. All the time, the Grand Inquisitor has been speaking. Christ has remained quite silent, said not a word, as on a previous occasion before Caiaphas. The Grand Inquisitor saw that the prisoner had been listening intently to him all the time, looking gently into his face, and evidently not wishing to say anything in reply. The old man would have liked him to say something, however bitter and terrible. But he suddenly approached the old man and kissed him gently on his bloodless, aged lips. That was all his answer. The old man gave a start. There was an imperceptible movement at the corners of his mouth. He went to the door and opened it and said to him, "Go and come no more. Don't come at all. Never, never." And he let him out into the dark streets and lanes of the city. The prisoner went away, leaving the old man with that kiss glowing in his heart and his idea staying in his mind. And so it remains still. This statue to Russia's national poet Pushkin was unveiled in June 1880, providing Dostoevsky with the opportunity he'd long sought, actually to speak to his fellow countrymen, exhorting them like the prophets of old, warning them of the dangers that lay ahead and of the ruinous consequences that would surely ensue if they followed the westernizers with their fraudulent promises of progress and freedom. Seemingly, everything that Dostoevsky most abhorred has come to pass in Russia. The institutions in which he pinned his hopes, the monarchy and the church, have collapsed. The one abolished and the other a shadow of itself. The revolution he so dreaded has happened. and the Westerners may be said to have triumphed in the sense that industrialization, science, and agnosticism are now the order of the day. Dostoevsky's great moment came on the third day. He delivered his address in this hall of columns, which was largely used in those days by the nobility for social occasions and to receive the imperial family. 44 years later, its name changed to the House of Trade Unions. Lenin's body was to lie in state there. One may imagine the scene. Dostoevsky, a truly prophetic figure, bearded, wild-eyed, his brow furrowed, and speaking, though from a prepared text, with great force and eloquence, and leading up to his tremendous climax, when he proclaimed the coming of a universal brotherhood, brought about not by socialism and revolution, but by the full and perfect realization of this Christian enlightenment of ours. In the serener circumstances of his last years, Dostoevsky's essential love of life and joy in all God's creation found a surer expression than ever before. Beauty, he makes Dmitri Karamazov, perhaps his favorite of the three brothers, say, is not only a terrible, it's also a mysterious thing. There, God and the devil strive for mastery, and the battleground is the heart of men.
Almost exactly 42 years ago, I was passing through Leningrad, and some impulse led me to seek out Dostoevsky's grave. I found it with some difficulty, and stood by it for a while thinking of this great writer, and of the extraordinary range of his genius and depths of his insights, and how his works, far from seeming to belong to a vanished past, grow ever more relevant to the dilemmas and distractions which are part of the experience of living in this world at any time and in any circumstances.
I was much younger then, of course, in sight of the beginning of a life, as now of its ending. In the intervening years, a great deal's happened to the world, to Dostoevsky's reputation, and for that matter, to me. Yet I still find myself marveling, as I did on that other occasion, at how one man's genius can, as it were, pick up all the strands of an age, revealing its pattern, all its absurdity, all its diabolism, and all its splendor. All the world in a grain of sand, Blake said. Yes, and all of life in a word.
On that previous occasion, when I visited Dostoevsky's grave, it had an air of neglect. Today, this is far from being the case. His reputation in his native Russia, after some ups and downs, stands higher than ever. His books are published in editions not of tens, but of hundreds of thousands. Every word he wrote is piously preserved, studied, and commented upon. Sometimes, I dare say, in ways that would surprise him. All this would be a source of great satisfaction to him. His love for his native Russia was one of the few wholly consistent themes of his life. Abroad, he was always homesick, and his faith that somehow Russia and the Russian people had some special role to fulfill in the working out of the world's destiny never wavered and only burnt brighter as the years passed.
Standing beside Dostoevsky's grave, it's impossible for me not to think of another, of which I've also got very vivid memories. I mean Tolstoy's at Yasna Polyana, on a ridge overlooking a forest, in which he was told as a child a green stick was buried, inscribed with the secret of everlasting happiness. Tolstoy never did find that green stick, and Dostoevsky never even looked for it. Yet somehow these two great Russian writers seem linked together. In life, as it happens, whether by accident or deliberation, they never actually met. But certainly they took great account of one another's works. Tolstoy, aspiring so ardently after his kingdom of heaven on earth and arriving at Astapava. Dostoevsky plunging down so frenziedly into his kingdom of hell on earth and arriving at Golgotha. Two parallel lines which Euclid told us never meet, but which Einstein's discovered, after all, do. It's where they meet that we mortals must live.